straight into the slides, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. There we go.
That's lovely. Okay, so thank you very much. So as an introduction to the topic, a good place to start with the recording, I'm just going to share this slide, which hopefully you can see now.
Yeah.
Great. Because on the left, you can see, I think there's 4 types of funding we get involved with. And I certainly know that applies to several people in the room. So you've got your straight, pure research bid, but it's never really pure research these days because we're meant to have impact. And certainly my early bids were more with SEMA, and you've always got to produce something that's going to have impact with their members and more generally. And of the many bids I've made and had near misses with the ESRC, again, impact is very much built into that. So although it may be a pure research on, or enable you to do what might consider just research, there's always this element of impact, and that's become more so in the last 10 years. My one thing I would say about accounting research that I put here is it's very good value for money. And this is both a blessing and a curse for accounting researchers, because my accounting organisations and society paper came from a bid from SEMA that was £7,000. So you can actually get really good results with not very much money. And in fact, we were finding it difficult even to spend all of that on the travel and everything else that we did, because quite a lot of our interviewees in the food industry prefer to talk on the phone. And what's more, they prefer to talk on car phone, which makes it really interesting when you're trying to interview them and they're doing 70 miles an hour down the M62. So I would say one thing about accounting research is it can be done with relatively few resources relative to other disciplines. But that means unless you employ a postdoc or something like this, you're unlikely to get a very large bid in this area. And that's a problem now when the ESRC have a minimum for their bids of 350,000 and have taken away the small bid side. So we have quite a lot of scope for research to do the smaller bids, but it makes it more difficult. And the other side, of course, is that a bit like submitting papers, you have to get used to being rejected. And what's worse is you have a lot of near misses. So I actually have a seal of excellence from the European Funding Council because I got 92.6% as a score, but they only funded projects above 95%. So they gave me an excellent certificate, but no money. So you end up doing a lot of work, and I've lost track of the times I've had the "your project is excellent, but we're giving the money to somebody else" letter. And I'm just waiting to see what happens to the one that's been with them for the last 6 months. So there is that type of research, but that's not actually what I'm going to talk about, because in the last 6 years, my focus has been elsewhere. So the other type of project you get as an accountant is what I call the accounting services. You're there to put the business side or the business case in a bigger project. And so I have been involved with some law and science projects where I'm producing the business case side or the accounting side or the cost benefit analysis or just advice on how to leverage the findings into industry.
Lisa, I'm
Yes?
sorry to cut across you. Could I ask you to move a bit closer to the microphone? Some of the audience members are finding it difficult to hear you.
Would it be, I can try putting headphones on if that might be easier.
Yeah, that might help. Thank you.
Okay, Stuart and I were saying earlier, it varies from meeting to meeting.
I'm not quite sure if we can hear you at the moment, Lisa.
I haven't said anything yet.
Oh, I can. Okay. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, I was just making sure that the screen had come up and told me it would change microphones. So is that clear enough now?
It seems so, yes. Thank you.
Okay. So as I was saying, I've had some success at being a small role on a big project in science or in one case in law, providing what I would call accounting services to the other researchers. and a bit of credibility to the bid when they need to have a business angle to it. And it's fun, and you get to meet a lot of people, and it's good for your profile. And you can say that you're part of a €3.5 million project, but you're not actually doing a great deal of work, and you may not get a paper from it. The other sort of funds available are teaching innovation funds, which I've had in the past. But my only lesson I learned from that is it's very difficult to get your innovation taken up afterwards unless you can spin out a company in some way, and that doesn't often happen. So that tends to be very localized, but making it national is tricky. So we have tried everything, quite a lot of things with about £50,000 worth of funding. We've had the platforms, but it's a high risk area. What has happened in the last few years is I've done far more on the research consultancy innovation side, and this is where the food fraud workers come in. And if I was really honest, this is what I enjoy most, because I get to meet so many interesting people. And despite the frustrations of sometimes working with external bodies, not least because when they say that universities are not very agile, what they really mean is that you have to wait for ages for the organisation to be ready, and they are. And that doesn't all, and inevitably that comes during your heaviest teaching period or something like that. But having said that, I found it worthwhile. So what I'm going to do is stop sharing the screen and just tell you a story for a few minutes about how this research consultancy and innovation work has taken off and why it's taken off. So what you have to do is go back to the horse meat scandal in 2013. And you'll remember, you may remember, that out of that came a government report headed up by Professor Chris Elliott, who often still speaks on the subject on TV. And I made a comment to Chris Elliott following the interim report that this didn't take into account any of the management or financial or accounting aspects of fraud, that it was very much concentrating on the food side, the food safety, food quality, food system side, whereas our view was it should be treated as fraud. And for me, this was useful because I've been researching food for a long time, but I also teach forensic accounting. So, and if you like, my two interests were coming together. Now, following that, he actually asked me to make a submission for the report. And if you are bored, you can go to page 114 of the Horse Meat Review and you will find part of my submission. And you will also find unattributed comments of mine throughout the report from here, just about 3 times. But so it had a bit of influence. And at the same time, I wrote a conversation article about how you had to treat food fraud as fraud, which got picked up quite a lot. And that's when things started moving, because as a result of that conversation article, I had linked up with our Centre for Counter Fraud Studies, who in turn are linked up with, at that time, PKF, the accounting firm, and now Crowe. And they actually started on the back of that a food fraud investigation or advisory practice, because we were the only people saying that you should treat it as fraud. And from that, I got lots of interesting invitations to speak at industry events and to individual companies and their supplier events. And I got invited in to what then became a group that had a project with the Food Standards Agency. Now, that was the first project that came out of it, and it was a substantial amount of money that was involved. And we put the report forward, which is still available. But the important point of that story is this: I'm now invited to tender for the Food Standards Agency bids. So as a result of all that trail coming together, I get invites to tender. So they have their open bids and they have their invited ones. And as a result of the invites to tender, the second one we did most recently on the cost of food fraud, which I'm doing with 2 economics partners, is that we won that bid, and we just submitted the report the other day, and we're being considered for the follow-up. So it sort of breeds success. But that wasn't the only thing that happened, because I got asked to do some work for a company on traceability systems, which is not public, so I can't tell you who it was. But that led to more invites. It increased my network. Not only did I get the funding for that particular piece of research consultancy, but I now have a whole group of people I can call on for letters of support for ESRC bids and similar. From that, I got invited to chair the Institute of Food Safety Technicians Conference in Birmingham, where I was introduced to somebody who was running a small tech company in food. At the same time, I'd been linking up with somebody internally who does AI. And to cut a long story short, we ended up getting a UKRI funding innovation bid with that company and with my colleague from computing. And on top of that, I started getting calls from complete strangers from my conversation article, which was reprinted in The Guardian and elsewhere. And one of those was from a group called the ERC Community, which in this case stands for Efficient Consumer Response. And they have a retail loss group. And as I tell people often, I'm never quite sure how a conversation about food fraud ended up with us doing a project on buy online and return in store shopping. But it did, and that was very successful. Led to another conversation article, which has led to more work. And they've now asked me to adapt the work to do food waste. And I have a large network now. We're doing workshops on a regular basis with the retailers who are all over Europe on that work. And not only that, but it's now my impact case study. So I'm going to put something up in a minute, but this has taught me a lot of lessons about how you start generating work in this area. Because a lot of it might look serendipitous, but in fact, it came from years and years of engagement and networking that didn't yield very much for 4 or 5 years, and then has now yielded quite a lot of research work. So the lesson really is you really have to do quite a lot of groundwork. All those things we get nagged to do actually pay off. Because even though I get far more attention from the conversation article than I do from my AOS paper, the AOS paper itself did get me into giving a talk for quite a prestigious series in London. It just hasn't led to any more money as yet. So what have I learned? Well, amongst other things, I've learned that my family are far more impressed with the 87,349 readers I have on the conversation and my book on Amazon than they are with my 1,000 citations on academic papers, which is, I'm told, less impressive. Or what do they know? Anyway, so move. Good, okay. So I would say there's lots of building blocks, and I think this probably applies now when you're making bids into Europe, whilst you have the chance, and into the research councils. I think the building blocks are really networking, engagement, media, and being businesslike. Because the networking and the engagement and the media articles got me the first job, but it was actually executing it, producing the report that got us essentially repeat business from the retailers in particular and from the FSA. So I would actually say that it may seem time consuming and it may seem that it takes up time, but it is worth going to those events when you're invited or even when you're not invited. If you can turn up to industry events and others, it's having some sort of engagement outside the university. And I know people keep going on about this, but it's worked for me. I guess the other thing I had an advantage on, if anything, was I've got something of a unique selling point because there's not many people looking at food and accounting and finance. I could probably name them all on the, there's about 4 or 5 of us all together. And I've been doing this for 20 or so years now. So I feel like I did create something of a niche that I could look at, which means that your name, so I'm now involved with a bid led by people from horticulture and agriculture, but that's because they knew of my work in this area, and again, they needed a business person involved. And there is something about having a bit of a reputation, because if I was honest, what gets me quite a lot of the research consultancy work in the first place is the fact that I've got an accounting qualification, and I spent 10 years as an auditor before I went into academic life, and that still seems to count for something. And then you build up credentials, and just like with the small business, there's a word of mouth goes round. And if you're seen as somebody who can deliver the results, or at least deliver disappointing news that you weren't able to do what they wanted, but there's a reason for it. And the cost of food crime remains to be seen. There is a way of calculating it, we just don't have the data. So I think those things it is, whether some like it or not, it is about the same thing of building a reputation and a set of credentials that helps you. And I suppose the last one I could put in here is just practice. I still go to training sessions. I'm still learning how to write a good bid that gets across and that doesn't sound overly academic, but it sounds very engaging. And I don't think you stop learning that, partly because people's expectations and the context keeps changing. So I hope that was entertaining enough. And I think now I'll just wait for the questions to come, because I've had my about 15 minutes, I think. Yeah. Thanks very much, Sarah.
Thank you, Lisa. That was very interesting. Thank you. And I think you've covered quite a lot of areas. I was thinking of a few questions as I was listening to you earlier on, and I think you've already answered all of those questions for me. Thank you. So we'll move on to Ian now, Professor Ian Thomson from Birmingham University. Ian researches, his research focuses on sustainability, the accounting impact on organisational decision making, and how that also impacts on society and the environment. And I understand that Ian also has had a lot of academic advisory roles, especially in terms of infrastructure and sustainability, in particular in Scotland as well. So thank you to Ian as well for taking the time to present today. So over to you, Ian.
Okay, thanks everyone. It's really good to see an audience full of people who possibly got more interdisciplinary experience than me. So to see this as part of a conversation. What I particularly want to do is talk about some of my kind of insights from doing interdisciplinary research, why to do it, and I think some of the lessons that I've kind of picked up, some which are very similar to Lisa's, on how to do interdisciplinary research. I think one thing I think I'd just like to kind of to start off with is just I'll pay a little tribute to when I started kind of research to Rob Gray and also to the academic community that was involved in, who encouraged interdisciplinary research from the very beginning, even though it was kind of looking at kind of research. And in some ways, sort of not a kind of it was respectful to a single discipline, but actually going, no, it's about the knowledge. We shouldn't actually get kind of like tacked in an individual discipline as a boundaries of ourselves as social scientists. And I think that was very kind of informative for me when I came into research. So from the very beginning, I didn't have a formal accounting disciplinary research training, even though I came in as an accountant. And I think that sort of healthy skepticism to disciplinary boundaries was kind of like baked into my research from the kind of the very beginning. So I'd just like to talk about some examples, maybe to give some people experience of some of the ways in which I've done some, these are just some of the examples where you kind of like stumble into, but kind of by accident in some ways. And it is very much, I think, this idea that you have a particular expertise as an accountant, and it's surprising how often you will get invited into projects if you ask, but you need to make yourself, you know, kind of aware. And I know Jan's in the audience, and I love Jan's one of Jan's stories was when she was talking to some hard-ass scientists about there was these things called sustainability accounting academics, and they said we didn't even know there was accounting academics. You know, so there are ways in which we need to raise our head above the parapet. I'm sure Jan will give us the correct version of that anecdote anyway. But these are just some examples of some of the interdisciplinary experience over time. First one was looking at cleaner technology. That was back in about 1991, 92, which is now called circular economy, you know. So that was one, working with people, industrial ecology, looking at activism, shadow accounting, big study on salmon farming in agricultural and food, working with the Parliament on infrastructure and climate change. The Centre for Social Environmental Accounting Research is a hybrid kind of interdisciplinary kind of organisation. Work with the UN development aid, trying to evaluate that. And then in a couple of the ones which have got the wee kind of like clouds around them are ones which I'm actually working on just now. So currently I'm director of Lloyds Banking Group Centre for Responsible Business, which is a kind of a by design interdisciplinary research centre looking at building the sustainability case for business. And within the centre, we have psychologists, sociologists, we have sustainability scientists, we have who else? We've got kind of a whole range of people, but we also built a network within the university now, with the university, of different kind of like disciplines, from engineering to eco-hydrologists to forestry people to philosophers and things like that, where we've built a network of connections. That's got a particular kind of task, and I'm lucky enough to be kind of bought out on that. It's a 5-year research project, which is good. Carbon accounting, doing lots of stuff on there, which it's intrinsically interdisciplinary. And another one which I'm involved in is Plastics Network in Birmingham, which is a network of people who are interested in looking if it's possible to have a sustainable future for plastics. And again, that's a kind of a vehicle that's around. And the other one in the top is Institute for Global Innovation, which is within Birmingham, is an inherently challenge-based interdisciplinary institution. And to those of you that are maybe starting off or in interdisciplinary research, it's useful to look at these networks, because as Lisa said, these things don't fall into your lap. So the Plastics Network is, is a discussion forum where people were interested in different things, and it's gradually over a couple of years formed into a network and started putting bids in for other kind of other issues. So I think you have to do your time, to be honest. If you're interested in interdisciplinary research, you have to go and talk to different disciplines. You have to participate in other disciplinary kind of like networks and step into them. And it really does. You really have to almost like earn your space on these projects, in terms of there. I think the kind of point is that we don't have much money in accounting and business, so therefore, if you're looking at big projects, you need to start to work with other people. Now, this is a particularly kind of messy diagram, but I was trying to organize in some structured way what were kind of like, what are the key lessons from interdisciplinary research, and there was millions of them. It's far too kind of too many. So I just started scribbling down some kind of points, and I'll kind of start, and I'll go through these in some kind of order that kind of goes there. I mean, the first thing to talk about, I think, in interdisciplinary research is that it's kind of hard. It's running against the tide of your discipline. You have to remember that often you will be upsetting people in your discipline when you're doing interdisciplinary research, because part of what you're saying is, you don't have enough knowledge in this discipline and to actually to solve any problems or to make a contribution. And I think accounting is one in there where we've actually embraced that interdisciplinarity early on, but I'm not sure we've actually kind of stepped properly. And I think we're other disciplinary and sometimes multidisciplinary, but I think that we need to do that because, again, it's hard. So if you're doing interdisciplinary research, you're often running against the tide in your discipline. And you also have to remember that in the other discipline, however old you might be, you're a kind of a newbie in that other discipline. Okay, so you're stepping in that way there. So there's a few things. You got to work out, why are we doing interdisciplinary research? It's likely to run against the tide, and there are significant issues with publishability of your work. Because you'll be dealing with different reputational hierarchies and different kind of quality standards and different ways of actually kind of doing things. So I think you have to have a really solid reason for doing interdisciplinary research. It's certainly not gap spotting. We really need to, you know, if you like, if you're trying to gap spot, you know, there's easier ways to get that kind of basic research out there. But what I've always found for interdisciplinary research is the idea if it's problem or challenge based. It sits outside the discipline. It's not necessarily an academic question. It's maybe a societal issue or an environmental kind of issue. And I think that in many ways, that's the kind of, in some ways, that's the starting point that you kind of want to kind of to look at. Now, I suppose the good news right now is there's a shift to challenge-based or problem-solving research, with impact is much more fundable now than single-disciplinary research. And I think that in accounting we're well placed for that to do. One of the other issues I think that is important is the idea of the domain knowledge of what it is you're actually kind of like researching. And that's where it's really important to actually to look at interdisciplinary things. I certainly find if you want to find out things about things, reading academic literature is not the good starting point. You actually kind of, it's very narrow, it's often driven. And I think that there's a real sense that we need to not just look at extending discipline, or kind of like disciplinary network to other academic disciplines, but also to extend beyond academic sources. Now, again, that's called the rest of the world. And so it's going to be a bit difficult to kind of to narrow that down a little bit, but it can be companies, can be industries, can be politicians, it can be activists, it can be social enterprises and business. So there's a whole range of things out there. So I think it's interdisciplinary in an academic sense, but I also think we need to expand to enter other disciplines and include the non-academic, if you like, within that kind of that network, particularly if we're going to understand what it is that we're actually trying to engage with. And my kind of sense is that the most successful interdisciplinary research are ones that have been driven by the challenge, which have been brought people together to get, and initially to get this rich interdisciplinary multiple expertise domain knowledge, which then kind of allows you to create or curate a unique assemblage of researchers to help you with your interdisciplinary research. And I think that that's one of the kind of the key things I would say is that when you get to interdisciplinary research, each project or each engagement is unique, and you have to look at it that, and you have to embed it within the domain knowledge and also with the kind of the challenge. And that creates a number of pragmatic management challenges. And I think good interdisciplinary research has to have you have to think about how you're going to manage the interactions and the engagements between the different disciplines. You cannot really let it happen, because if you don't, by accident, you'll maybe find single disciplinary hegemony, or you'll actually find that there's nothing and everyone's firing off in different disciplines, and what you've got is lots of disciplinary research projects that actually don't interconnect with each other. So I think, you know, you've got to think about that very, very carefully and appreciate that any point in time, you'll have to be dealing with hybrids, with kind of like constructs, synthetic constructs between different theories and different disciplines as well. And I think you have to be open to that, that sometimes that violence, I'll use case of violence to your kind of like your theories and your ideas from other disciplines, at the same time realizing that you might actually have to enact violence to their pet theories, their methods, their data, their ways of analysis, their theories and their ways of actually kind of like understanding different things. But you need to have an openness to their different things and recognize and embrace what they can actually bring to the table. At the same time, you have to be very clear at saying, well, if I am a social science researcher with expertise in accounting, what are you going to bring to this interdisciplinary kind of projects? And sometimes articulating that is there. So I think there's a kind of an issue about, I like Svedberg, his notions of theorization, where actually we need to look at the almost like the creation of particular theories in unique assemblages to resolve specific kind of problems or challenges there. And I think you need to look at this idea of the connectability and the coherence of the way in which you bring together different disciplines. We have to remember that even though it's there, we have to kind of go back to our kind of basic methodology and make sure things are coherent and connectable in a logically kind of coherent way. In terms of research design, we might need to change the research. We need to maybe change our standards of acceptable data. And you know, in some cases, you'll find that other disciplines have a much harder kind of restrictions on what they count as data and evidence. And we'll find that other disciplines are actually much more open, even in people on the edge of accounting, kind of critical accounting or interpretive accounting kind of research. We'll sometimes, you know, those people there that will look and say, oh, look at these wonderful kind of like anarchic kind of researchers, and they're just dismissed by other disciplines for being far too structured and far too focused. There's a lot of relativity when we're looking at these different things. So you need to have a, you know, I think an understanding of these different sort of like methods. In a way, you've almost got to think of it as, I find it very useful to look at things from things like boundary objects or mediating instrument type thing, and look at the project as the challenge as a boundary object, something that has an element of commonality that we can actually engage upon, but also is loose and, if you like, ambiguous enough for people to join together from different disciplines, but still have a sense of concreteness that allows people to kind of to move forward on a kind of a project. And you also typically, if you're doing challenge-based research, then you really need to think about your theories of change and theories of impact, not just in terms of the kind of the notion of how we can do things academically, but often you'll find more and more that the kind of the research funding is really focusing on problem solving or challenge based type of kind of like research. And I think that that's it there. But I mean, I have to kind of say that in many ways it's about building, trying. I think it's very difficult to get this kind of right, but it's hard. As I said, it's one of these things to come up with kind of key lessons, and I don't know if there is a way to do it. I think it's not gap spotting. I think often focusing on challenge, but recognizing that it's actually going to be a kind of a unique, dynamic kind of assemblage for each project that you actually do, with different kind of like stakeholders, different actors, different disciplines. And actually it's about being open and finding a way in which you can engage with these different things. As I could go through how this would apply in different projects, but they are almost this uniqueness as part of the issue. And I think what's be easier if we deal with these things in terms of maybe questions and discussion. So I will stop there and thank you for listening. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Ian. Again, just like Lisa, you covered so many aspects there, and I've been reading the questions that are already coming in, looking at the chat function now. So I'll try my best to make sure that we address all the questions. And to the audience, please feel free to continue typing in your questions as we go through them. Listening to both Lisa and Ian, I think one thing that seems to become clear to me is, especially for PhD students and early career researchers in accounting, it seems that accounting researchers need to be quite open-minded in terms of what accounting actually means. And where accounting research can actually take you, because what we're clearly seeing here is that accounting can take you to many different areas, social issues, policy issues, sustainability, impact issues as well. And that takes me to one question, which I'll just have a quick look for it. I think it was Jan that asked the question. If I can find it. Yes, a question from Jan Bebbington for Lisa and Ian. How do you narrate what accounting is to academic collaborators? So that's open to Ian and Lisa.
Okay, well, thank you, Jan. I tend to have a very kind of like a loose definition of accounting, which is really about the evidence that's required for better decision making and evaluation. So it's almost going along the monitoring, and I certainly find that a way to get the link in is using sort of phrases like monitoring and evaluation, which again typically follows most public sector or kind of projects where they actually kind of like build that in. So I find it's very useful to look at accounting as a sort of like an evidence-based approach to monitoring and evaluation as the hook. And then once you're kind of in, you can then start to bring in aspects of accounting as a social and kind of like organizational and political process and series of kind of like techniques that actually sort of brings it in. But interestingly, an awful lot of these interdisciplinary projects are looking for the kind of, it's strange as accounting academics, but they're looking for the rigor that accounting thinking actually brings into these projects. So you normally don't have to do the, oh, you know, like we know all these funny theories. They're actually they're looking for that type of thing, which and you kind of go in. But that's my sense. But then I'm you know, to training, I'm a management accountant, so we've always slightly, it's not about, it's about thinking about kind of like protocols and decision and, you know, kind of like decision relevance rather than coming from that perspective. So I use a lot of this stuff from management accounting research to look at that. I don't know if that answers the question, but I'm sure Lisa will nail it.
I'm not sure it's I think in terms of nailing, it's one of those nailing the jelly to the wall questions, isn't it? When the question is, I try and avoid getting into sort of what accounting isn't, but I tend to get people to try and think it out, because quite often people approach you and either they're thinking about cost benefit analysis, or they're thinking about audit, or you just get a few occasions where they think it's all about the balance sheet and profit and loss account, says she, showing her age. So I do two things depending on the situation. One is I either turn it around and stop talking about accounting and just talk about people and how they use information and accounting and how they make decisions. So, you know, it gets into the monitoring and evaluation question. The other thing I do is just ask them what they think it is. And in fact, the AI work came out of that because Edward, who is the AI expert I work with, first of all, had a very narrow view, but after 3 hours of talking about process, we realized that accounting was processes, and it wasn't that dissimilar from the work he'd done on black boxes and aeroplanes. And from that, we've built up quite an understanding of how to look at accounting as a series of points. We call them checks and balances, and his world, they'd call them sensors. So I think it's, rather than getting into defensive discussion, you bring people into it, and then you start looking, well, let's just talk around it. And I find it's, for myself, I use quite a lot of stories to give an idea of what accounting is. And if you want to really throw people, you start telling them there's such a thing as accounting history, that usually, and there are journals of accounting history, and then they're usually really interested, and there it is. It's not a, you can't nail it as a one. You just tell people how interesting the subject is, and that there's more to it than they thought.
The only thing I'd add into that is a kind of a respect for the challenge and a respect for the other disciplines as well.
Absolutely.
I think if you're going into these conversations, you owe it to the other people in the conversations to at least do some basic, kind of pre-studies into their disciplines as well, so that you're familiar with the language and also the kind of the challenge, and to get the language that's relevant not relevant, that's appropriate or even dominant in these different kind of like contexts.
I think that's right. And my other technique is just to ask lots of questions and say, do some groundwork, but just say, well, tell me what you're actually looking for. Tell me something more about what you're doing, and then make it a sort of two-way conversation about pulling it out. And you learn a lot. I still have struggles, though, talking to economists. I'm quite sure. It might just be me.
You're just talking to wrong economists. There's some nice ones out there.
No, the ones I talk to are lovely. They're just, I ask questions. I get them to explain it to me, which is actually, by the way, a really useful technique in the food industry, where people are obviously far more expert in the industry than I am. So I get them to tell me. I ask them questions.
Is it okay, Sarah, if I pick that thing that Stuart's asked about early career researchers and things? My advice is to go to, and you're really kind of like fortunate in universities, in that there will be every day almost at a university, there will be an open seminar on topics that you can go and sit in. And I have to say, as an accounting researcher, I got most of my research ideas by going to as many seminars in accounting in as many different related institutions as I could. I think people were bored with me. I was based at kind of Heriot Watt, and I would go across to seminars in Glasgow, at Edinburgh University, up to Dundee, and just sit in the back for a while and listen and really get a sense of what's actually going on. Ask a question and things like that. As I said, if once people know you as a human, and you can engage with them as a scientist, as well in scientific discussions, I think that's a really good way to go about it. Just sit. It's like a lot of things. You sit in the back, and then you gradually, if you sit there for long enough, you get to the middle, and then sometimes you get to the front row, and then occasionally you'll get dragged up to the very front and say, like, turn around and tell people what you think. Do the time. Do the time. Do the time, and invest in knowledge.
It also seems that your close relationships with the industry as well, and with being on committees, seems to help you in gaining research funding. And that takes me to the next question posed by Hafez Abdo. I hope I've said that correctly. And the question is, to what extent networking and personal connections underpin successful funding applications? And that question is for Lisa, but I'm sure Ian will obviously have experience to share on that as well.
I don't think, except in a very few situations, it will win you the bid, but it will help you put the bid together. Because you actually need, if it's even for a smaller bid, you need support. So you'll usually need referees, or you'll need letters of support. And also, if you're building up a project and you want to be able to have, to have real world connections, then you'll need to be talking to people. So for me, a lot of that networking does three things. It helps me to find academic and external partners. It helps me to draw on people for letters of support and sort of tangible support, not just, yes, this sounds like a good idea. And it helps you to refine the ideas in the project so that you know it's likely to have some sort of impact. So I think the networking is all part of building your skills as somebody who looks for funding and who carries out projects that have results. Not all the bids are blind refereed, but most people will not referee a bid and go through because they know the person. It still has to meet all the other criteria. And what I find is I've been more successful the more I can draw on other people and their ideas, even if I'm just using them to test out. So this partnership we have with the ECR community is really good because it's got to the stage where I can just send an email saying, look, we're thinking of doing this. Is it realistic? And quite often I'll get something back that says, I think you should talk to this person. So I think as early career researchers, it's good to go for smaller bids first where you don't need quite so much. But when you're doing the bigger bids, you really do need this whole support system behind the bid that you have to get over, that you have the resources and the connections to carry out that work. So you need to have a network you draw on. And then it's sort of, what I find now is that I get invited to join bids because I've got a network. So, and they know that I can find people to help. And that's certainly true of the last bid that's being led by somebody else, where I managed to bring in 3 letters of support. So I hope that answers the question to some extent, but interesting to see what Ian thinks.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. The only thing I would say is that sometimes you can be quite a bit, just because you're networking with business doesn't mean you can't be provocative. They're expecting you to be provocative. As again, we have a kind of, we look at businesses and say, well, they've got this expertise, but they also look at us and say, we have expertise. We have different ways of looking at things. We have access to networks and resources that they can only dream of, in particularly kind of time to resolve these different things. So we should be a wee bit, shoulders back, kind of walk in. I've got something to offer, and by the way, here's some ideas. So here's some provocations. And I've seen situations where people have gone in and, done, Foucauldian critiques of what kind of people are actually saying without necessarily talking about the theory, but actually, they're interested in being provoked. Now, there is a balance between going in and sort of going, oh, by the way, you're all shit, you know nothing sort of thing. But you also have to go in and say, we have a critical edge here. We have a different way of looking at things. And if you can give examples in the conversations about how to do things different, because in some ways they have troubles with imagining the kind of like how to do things differently. And I think, and I know a lot of people that it's not, you're not going in and just being aggressive. It's about going in and arguing with them, in a way that's conceptually kind of like valid and is also kind of evidentially kind of like balanced. So
that's a really good point. And yes, I've had some good experience where it's been both ways. I've been challenged, but also people have come to me and said, well, is there a way we could look at this differently? Or following what you said in that presentation, can we try this? Or we might try that. And it does. And I'm always surprised at how much respect accountants get, actually. And I think this is something Christine Cooper and Leslie Catchpole once told me, that they were quite surprised to be brought in and people were actually quite deferential to their expertise. And they didn't realize it was, you know, it gave them a realization of how much value they actually were bringing, even to what seemed like a very simple project. And I hope I've not misquoted them in that, but that's what I remember of the story. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Nurul, who is asking, that the question is posed to Ian. Could you please elaborate your experience on pragmatic management challenge and how do you deal with it?
Okay, so the first thing you've got to do is when you're pulling together an interdisciplinary team is get to know each other, and in particular get an understanding of people's kind of knowledge and sort of like share kind of experiences, and get that type of understanding, develop a mutual understanding of what's actually going on. Often it's strange that quite often the structure of putting together these big ESRC bids where you've got work streams, work packages, are actually quite good ways to break down a complex issue into different kind of perspectives. Get little teams, you know, kind of like working on your own. So I think never give one person one task. Have overlapping kind of like teams to actually to build things up, and have regular meetings where you bring people together, go off, do it. But as I said, it's always going to depend upon the size of the project. But if we're looking at something substantive, try and not say, you, the accountant, go and do the finance. It's like you, the accountant, and perhaps the engineer go off and look at the kind of how costing or kind of implements in it. And if you like in the engineering, send the sociologist with the engineering, send the the ecologist off with the different people. So trying to make sure that when you're dealing with a complex project, that each of the tasks contains in itself interdisciplinary stuff, and that's a very good way to actually do it, because it means that when you bring things together, there's already an interdisciplinary sort of framework. I think not agreeing a big grid in the beginning, you know, like of here is how we will do things. It's like agreeing kind of points of principle, and then saying something like, well, we'll do the best science possible, you know, and actually we'll use the sort of like the most appropriate kind of leading edge methods, and we'll kind of like in theory and different things like that. And so not being too detailed and too prescriptive in how you kind of manage it, but in terms of kind of like principles. But there's nothing like getting together regularly to do things, and even not to discuss progress, just to get and talk about ideas, and actually kind of say, well, what insights have you got from the work so far? It's academics were really bad at, you know, like I think about kind of rigid following these different things, and you know, following process and procedures and getting it all agreed beforehand. The ones which I have been involved in that typically are the ones that have got to the end of the project, there's no publication, there's no impact, you've done the job, you've got justified the grant, but it goes nowhere. The ones where you have that sort of different approach, where you know, it's not you know, having a project where the accountant does the accountant, the economist does the sociologist does that, is not interdisciplinary research. You know, so build in that interdisciplinarity in the activities, and have lots of times to sit down and to discuss and to adapt and change.
That's a good piece of advice. That, Lisa, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think it's excellent advice, and it certainly describes the projects that have gone better that I've been involved in. I think you need to build in that collegiality, and you've got an opportunity to meet people and hear them as well. I think the practical piece of advice is don't forget that you can build the cost for the meetings, if needed, into the project funding. So quite a lot of the bigger projects I've been involved with, they build in costs for meetings at regular times, and they build in the travel. Or what we're doing with our next one is building in the costs of getting some of the meetings handled professionally online, which we had experience of recently. It worked a lot better when we got a professional convener in. With all due respect, Stuart, but it's...
I mean, other stuff which have worked well is getting sort of like an artist. I mean, some of the sessions actually is to get, and they do some amazing work where as you're talking, they're creating art, you know, sort of mapping the kind of the all that sort of different things into the actual process, and that works. I first came across that when I was doing interdisciplinary work, not with other academics, but with kind of like social networks and activists, and they did that, and it was just amazing. And this were people with had learning difficulties. They enable them to participate in the discussion, and they're actually kind of like they're drawing art round about you as you're doing it. So, and you can build these in, and it's disgracefully cheap when you the quality and of the expertise of these people who are able to do these things. And so it's like putting everybody on a level playing field, you know, is a very, very good thing there. And I know Jan's just said, yeah, food and walking and stuff like that. Sorry, I'll just take a little bit of time, but my brother-in-law is a real hard-assed kind of like science, you know, high energy kind of stuff, CERN, you know, atomic stuff. They have these conferences now where they don't, if they're going to try and do interdisciplinary stuff, they don't present papers. They basically go off for the weekend somewhere nice, lock the doors, and talk about their mistakes. and that's you know, that's it. What didn't work? What didn't get, you know, everyone can read the papers, what didn't work. And it seems counterintuitive to actually just to have that space to go off, take all these incredibly kind of like busy, you know, that, I mean, I remember Paul telling me he's really pleased he got his grant, and you talked 100,000, you talk $100 million, you know, like to actually to get it. Those type of people, they go off for weekends to effectively, you know, cabins in the wood and talk about their research. You know, doesn't, you think, well, that's not how your man from Big Bang Theory we think would work, but that's how in practice, that's how they develop a lot of their thinking.
And I suppose that approach also, it stays in touch with the issues as well. It's grounded with those problems, with those real lived experience problems, isn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely. The next question comes from Karen McBride, and I assume it's for both Ian and Lisa. Do you think it is more straightforward to carry out interdisciplinary research by going out to the rest of the world rather than trying to find other academic disciplines to work with? Those external to academia may be more open to working with academic accountants, ? And I'd like to add an extra sub-question to that as to what advice would you give somebody to actually go out to the rest of the world in an effective way?
It's a good question. Shall I go first, Ian, or would you like to?
Yeah, you go first. You go first on that one.
I suppose on a straight way, yes, maybe going out to do interdisciplinary research by, say, working with retailers or a food company or something may seem more straightforward, though you have to do this groundwork, as we keep saying, to get yourself into a position to do that. But it's not really interdisciplinary research. You do need to pull in other academics from other disciplines. Now, I suppose in the area I'm in, I by default meet agricultural economists, I meet farm management academics, scientists, market people, policy people, because we've sort of got the events just bring in those different types of people. And I think to get sort of the theory development and the methodology, you do need to work with people in other disciplines. And sometimes that comes from just making friends with people on a temporary or long-term basis. And the work evolves. So part of it is actually you talk to people in other disciplines. And I guess I started out by going to a lot of agricultural conferences just because there weren't, there are no niche conferences on on accounting as such. You have to go out to other disciplines. And, you know, that was great, not least because they have the sort of format for their conferences where you spend one day listening to papers and the second day out in the field looking at John Deere tractors or visiting sites. So you do get generating ideas that way. I don't know, it works both ways. I've had experience of both. I've had academics who are willing to work with academic accountants, and I've had people from outside. I don't think one's more open than the other. I think it's more to do with context. And sorry, Sarah, I've forgotten your follow-up question. I should have written it down.
Any advice for somebody who wants to try and get into the industry, right? So to get out of the academic world, as it were, and start networking with the aim of trying to get funding? Yeah,
well, the first thing is to do the time, as Ian says. He may have gone to a lot of seminars. I basically went to as many free industry events as I could. So go to events at the Institute of Chartered Accountants Hall, where you will meet people from different practitioners. Go to professional body events. With some of the industry events, they might be quite costly, but you can sometimes talk your way into a cheap ticket as an academic. Offer to present on an interesting topic and in the best case scenario, they fly you out to the event, but that's never happened to me. Happened to somebody else I know. Go to local, and if your budget doesn't do, then there's local chambers of commerce. There's events that are put on. You just have to turn up and talk to people. Practice your small talk. The thing that improved greatly when I became an academic was that my small talk with people in public gatherings became better. And quite frankly, you don't need to sound clever. You know, have you traveled far will get you quite a long way into a conversation sometimes.
For me, I'd turn that question round and say, what is it that you want to do as an academic? What is important to you? What are the kind of like, what's your kind of like passion? What's the things that annoy you? What are the kind of the transformations that you would like to achieve? And then sort of try and build from that as much as anything. And I mean, I think that's, you know, that's implicit in what Lisa said. You made the decision to go to agricultural things, so that must have been something that was, you know, kind of like that was important. You know, doing things on environmental kind of like issues, because that was something that drove me as a person. And you know, and I know from talking to the people around, other people have these passions, and it's that's I think it's the kind of the problems, the challenges, and the passion that should really determine to what extent, because it's going to differ. If industry are nowhere near taking the sort of steps that you want to do, then you have to kind of start to say, well, this is an academic issue. We need to gather the evidence. We need to do it. You have to think of it almost, if you're going to do these things, you need all of the elements at a kind of point in time, but it'll depend on the state of the domain. That's where domain knowledge comes in. You know, you have situations where if you're in the tech sector, they're thinking on kind of data and stuff, and intelligence is way, you know, kind of there. And if you want to find out where the edge is, you tend to talk to them rather than academics. But in other areas, if it's something to do with sustainable food, I suspect you'd maybe want to talk to some of the food research centres who are academics. But so it very much depends upon the domain. You need to understand the domain before you can make that sort of decision.
I think I can see in the chat box that Atul has added to that by saying social media like Twitter or LinkedIn are also great in helping to network and finding relevant events and people with similar interests as well. Yeah,
I can't claim any great expertise in that area. I know that certainly there's others in the discussion who are kind of better at that. But yeah, it's a good place to start. And certainly LinkedIn has been surprisingly productive with people getting in touch with ideas and things like that, which you wouldn't think. But I think it goes back to the core. We're often we're hypercritical of our own work because we're trained to be hypercritical. That's our job, you know, and we look at kind of like levels of ignorance, and we know areas, zones the ignorance that we need to kind of like address, and holes in our thinking and stuff like that. But actually, you know, we have this sort of what do you call it, knowledge, and people are interested in talking to us. We need to stop the myth that's actually kind of like that's portrayed that we're ivory tower, and that we don't have any purpose for the kind of the world, and it's like us and them. It's simply not true. You know, go talk to people. But as I said, each one I think has got to be created based on the domain and the empirical context. That's.
And I suppose in terms of trying to explore new ideas or find challenges or problems to study, social media can help in that sense. But also, I remember somebody telling me a few years ago, and I think this echoes what Ian was saying in his presentation earlier, not to focus too much on reading academic papers, but also, and this was the piece of advice that I was given, was to read journals published in the industry and articles. For example, you know, my industry is taxation and accounting, so I'll read the tax journal from the CIOT, for example. And in those articles, they highlight current issues. One at the moment is obviously COVID-19 and financing the furlough scheme, etc., and how we're going to maximise tax revenue. But it keeps you in touch with real life problems, and it keeps your research relevant, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't disagree with that, and I'm sure other people might be able to switch their mics off and jump in on that one as well. So.
I've got a feeling I may, and apologies if I'm wrong, but I think we've covered most. There's lots of comments that are being typed in the chats box, but I think I've covered all the questions that have been typed in there. One question from me, is that we've looked at all the positive aspects, the good bits about getting funding from the industry, but do you, and this is a question for both Ian and Lisa, do you have any experiences or any advice in terms of, if you do get funding from the industry, which is probably looking more likely for us academics now, given the current circumstances we're in, and there's less public funding now being provided by government, which may mean that academics might have to approach the private sector and the industry to get funding. Do you have any experiences in terms of how that industry or that organisation that's given you the money, how they shape your research findings, dare I say it, or how do they restrict or limit what you can do?
Yeah, I mean, it would be wrong to say that that doesn't happen. And certainly you will find some of the positive and negative experience have both been with accountancy bodies. We've had research from them where, again, I wouldn't want to mention and name it, but one where the thing was submitted and then a totally kind of like a report came out, you're going, didn't write that. And what they were trying to do with the kind of committee for approval, it had gone, you know, and certainly publishing in some of these reports, you know, was actually kind of very difficult, and in fact, almost you had to fight with them over it, and had to actually to do that. I think it can be difficult, and again, you've got sometimes difficult with confidentiality in terms of your publishing, but I think you've got to make that decision in terms of what you're actually, you know, you have to go in with your eyes open. If you're getting money from a company to do research, you have to say, well, they're given money for something. They're more likely to have a transactional logic. So you need to explore that at the very beginning. Set the ground rules and say, well, what is it that you're actually sort of like you're asking us to do. Now there is a problem. The more money depending on who your money is, bits of you have to be realistic that some of your independence as an academic goes with the funding. You know, even if it's things like you have to produce a report, you have to produce certain things, there are ties to it. So you know, getting funding is, you know, you know, I tend to look at funding as at one level it can be really enabling and empowering, but the other, it's actually very restricting. In that you know, they're giving you money. There's a transactional logic there, so you need to sort of like to look at that as part of the engagement. And it's unlikely that you're going to be able to turn around and say the people giving me the funding are dreadful. What's more likely to happen is you don't produce it or you don't publish from it. And I think there'll be a lot of stuff which isn't published in that sense. It doesn't mean it's not useful research, but it's the publications of it. So you need to be very careful about what are the ground rules, what are you going to do, what's the ethical position. You know, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done before you take money. And I have not gone for money for an awful lot of my academic career because of that. Because if you want control over your findings, you want to kind of like be 100% sort of like that's it. You want to have the freedom to do what you want to do. Don't take the money. You know, I don't know. that's you know, your heads of department and people like that wouldn't necessarily like it, but you know, see what, if you care enough about it, do it in your own time. You know, do it in your own time. But you take the money, You take the money, it's a contract. Read the contract, read the small print, and think of the consequences. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the myths is that there is a lot of money in industry for research. And it's not necessarily the case with accounting. The accounting bodies they tend to use certain people, but they don't do much. It's the accounting bodies who give the money. It's not necessarily the accounting firms. You may be doing more of a subcontracting or something with an accounting firm, but most of the projects come through the bodies. With the work that I do, I keep being told, oh, you can get money from the food companies. Well, they don't have spare money. That's part of my research. They just don't have that extra money. What they do have is they put through this organisation I work with. So this ECR community I keep mentioning, its reason for existing is to bring academics and industry together. So again, if you've got a mediating body, that helps. And I've not really had anything negative. You get your pride stung a bit when they say, well, that set of PowerPoints is too academic. And you think, well, I've put it in as plain English as I possibly can. And then it comes back to you reworked as a series of pictures. And actually, when you give the presentation, you realize it did work a lot better. They've got a lot more expertise in communication. I think I've had more negative experiences just in carrying out the contracts, in that you set a timeline, you say when you're available, and then you're waiting on the organisation. So the worst one I had was when I said, yes, I can do that between this date and that date. And we didn't even have the contract signed till 3 months after that last date. And then it ran into my sabbatical and everything else. So you have to be, you don't always have as much management over the projects as you think. Also, I think you have to be a bit, I've learnt to be firmer. So with a recent one where the organisation said, well, we'd rather you said this, and can't you do some more work and find this? And I just went back to the meeting a week later and said, it's not possible and we're not going to do it. You're asking A, for something you've not paid for. You're not paid for the time. And B, it just can't be done. And in fact, in the end, they came back and said, okay, we see that. But, we could have just run on for ages trying to follow them on exactly everything they wanted. But you've got to be pragmatic and say, there's a bit of this pragmatic management again, and say, look, you paid for this much time. You're asking for something for which the data doesn't exist. We've given you an extra week and we've looked at it and it's not possible. And sometimes when you hold your ground and have the discussion, it works. Other times you never see the report published.
Yeah. I think we also got to recognize that a lot of the academic journals don't publish this stuff as well. They often, one of the problems with interdisciplinary research is that regardless of where it's funded from, it is potentially going to be, not meet the standards of top-end disciplinary journals, because you've actually had to do that. We're quite lucky in accounting in that we have journals who allow interdisciplinary work, and sort of like the EOS is a good example, Critical Perspectives, AAAJ, just off the top of my head, where they allow interdisciplinary accounting research interdisciplinary research to a certain extent, but other kind of like journals, other disciplines are maybe not as accommodating, So, as I mentioned the Cleaner Technology project that we kind of worked on, and that was that was a great eye opener. That was like, sort of research centre for social science at Edinburgh University, with people who, kind of like worked with people who are now like household names. We worked with, Erasmus, Danish Sustainable Science Centres and everything like that. We had a really, really good project. It was absolutely brilliant. There wasn't one academic publication from it. There wasn't one academic publication from it, because at the time there wasn't a kind of a route for cleaner technology. There was a book and a report to the EU that kind of went out, and it was it was a 2 million project that was kind of involved in. not a single academic kind of like peer-reviewed journal output from it. And that was from a bundle. And I was like the baby in the corner, but they were people who were leaders in the field and they couldn't get it in there. So again, it's like you just got to look at what's there. But as I said, it was a great piece of research, you know, and it did have impact. There's no academic publications from it. So, you know,
Yeah.
they're definitely, it's not, you know, as I said, you're sometimes running against the tide against conventional reputational hierarchies. My kind of big picture stuff is do it, it works out in the long term. But,
Yeah. Well, I'm conscious of the time now. We're nearing the end now of the session. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank again Professor Lisa Jack and Professor Ian Thomson for their time and for sharing their experiences and for providing such useful advice to us all. And I hope that everybody has taken something from today's session. I certainly have. I think I've got 4 pages of notes that I've been writing as I've been listening for the past hour. So I hope that everybody's enjoyed it. I think it's gone well, being our first virtual plenary session, and the IPSIG, we're hoping in future to hold many more as well. So I hope you can all join us. We will obviously be emailing you of any future events that we'll be hosting. The next part of today's session is the annual general meeting, the AGM, for the IPSIG members. So for those of you who don't want to attend that, you're free now to come off this session. For those who are attending the AGM, I propose that we have a 5-minute break if that's okay. Stay on the Zoom, but just close off your cameras and mute your microphone, and we will start the AGM in 5 minutes time, which I make it to be 25 minutes to 3. Okay, so thank you everyone, and for those who are staying on for the AGM, I'll see you in a few minutes. Bye.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you.